Napoleon Bonaparte was undoubtedly one of the most influential military figures in history. He reshaped the map of Europe and in the process changed the way wars were fought. These military successes, however, were built upon a foundation of political alliances and a complicated bureaucratic organization that expanded after each victory, eventually encompassing nearly the entire continent. In the rapidly changing landscape that was revolutionary and then imperial France, Napoleon was in constant need of people to manage his empire at the same time that he expanded it. When in need, who better to rely upon than family? He followed a policy of using his family to strengthen his own position both in France and Europe as a whole, through marriage and placing members of his family in charge of large parts of the continent. The results of his efforts, in the end, turned out mixed. Due to attending military school at a young age, Napoleon's chances to interact with his father, Carlo Bonaparte, were limited before his death in 1785. Worse yet, his father had left the family in a tough financial situation due to his gambling habits and poor investments. Napoleon's mother, on the other hand, Lucian Bonaparte, would live much longer, taking care of the family as best she could. With very limited funds, she managed to pay for schooling for the family until Napoleon graduated and became the main income earner. After Napoleon fell out with the Corsican patriots in 1793, the family was forced to flee to mainland France, leaving most of their possessions behind. The family first settled in Toulon before the British occupied the city, and the family once more was forced to flee, this time to the city of Marseille. Now essentially without money, the family survived on Napoleon's income as an officer, and whatever his mother could scrape together. As Napoleon's political fortunes improved, so too did the living conditions for the rest of the family. Lucia did not, however, approve of Napoleon's marriage to Josephine, as she had not been consulted. While Napoleon's career was on the rise, his mother spent most of her time supporting the rest of the family. When Joseph became ambassador to the papacy, she accompanied him before eventually moving back to Corsica for several years. Once Napoleon became first consul, she moved to Paris for a time, before moving once more, this time to Rome, to support her son Lucian, who had secretly married against Napoleon's wishes, leading to a falling out between the brothers. When Napoleon became emperor in 1804, Lucia would move back to France with the title Madame Mother, but would mostly keep to herself and not get involved in court politics. Despite the distance that she kept from the grand ambitions of her son, she would nonetheless accompany Napoleon to Elba during his first exile, and again on his march to Paris during the 100 Days. On the 29th of June, 1815, she would see her son Napoleon for the last time. Lucia would spend the rest of her life in Rome, under the protection of the Pope, where she would live in relative comfort due to her personal investments and the selling off of jewelry. In 1836, at the old age of 85, Lucia would pass away, 15 years after the death of her son Napoleon. Joseph Bonaparte was Napoleon's older brother, born a year before him in 1768. He would not go into the military like his brother and instead became a lawyer. When the family fell on hard times during the early days of the Revolution, however, he would transition into politics thanks to Napoleon's military influence. Joseph accompanied his brother during part of his first Italian campaign, assisting in negotiations and other tasks that Napoleon wanted entrusted to someone that he could count on. In 1796, he participated in the reconquest of Corsica from Paoli, the Corsican patriot that Napoleon had once supported, and even forced the French off the island thanks to British aid. Afterwards, Joseph became a representative in the French government as part of the Council of 500 for Corsica. When Napoleon launched his coup of 18th Brumaire, Joseph did not participate directly, but his political career greatly benefited from it. After the coup, he found himself involved in increasingly important negotiations with foreign powers, including both the United States and Britain. Joseph and Napoleon were not without friction, however, as when Napoleon became first consul for life, Joseph claimed that he was first in line for succession, due to Napoleon having no children. Napoleon, meanwhile, favored the son of his brother, Louis, becoming the heir. After the declaration of the French Empire, the disagreement became bad enough that Napoleon offered to make Joseph the king of Lombardy if he would drop his claim. With the outbreak of war once more in 1805, the Kingdom of Naples under Ferdinand initially made a deal with Napoleon that in return for French forces leaving the country, it would be neutral in the conflict. After French troops left, Ferdinand quickly went back on his word, switching sides to declare for the coalition. He allowed both Russian and British troops to land and prepared for war with France. Angered by the betrayal, Napoleon sent Joseph with an army to invade Naples and seize the country. While Joseph was nominally in charge of the invasion, it was actually led by Marshal Massena. After defeating Naples' rather weak field army, the French were forced to subdue the remainder of the country, which proved to be the harder task. A guerrilla movement quickly began that would not be suppressed for some time, and several fortresses that refused to surrender had to be besieged. Nevertheless, Joseph would be appointed King of Naples by Napoleon in March 1806, with only Sicily remaining out of reach. Joseph's primary goal as king was to reform the country in the spirit of the Revolution, enacting wide-sweeping changes to the country's organization. Napoleon, meanwhile, demanded that his brother contribute to the war effort against Britain in the Mediterranean. As a result of the treasury being taken by the fleeing Bourbons, the country was initially without money for either. It took a large increase of taxes, the confiscation of church property, and an end to feudalism to stabilize the country and allow Joseph to begin enacting non-economic reforms. Conditions gradually improved, but despite Joseph's reforms, significant resistance to his rule remained. Multiple plots to assassinate him were stopped, and resistance against military conscription was fierce. After 2 years, though, he had achieved a great deal of success, and was generally popular enough among both the elites and the population. Unfortunately, he would then be called away by Napoleon to be placed on the Spanish throne, where he would face much greater difficulties. Revolts across Spain would begin not long after Joseph's arrival in 1808, forcing him to abandon the capital of Madrid. Retreating with the rest of the French army, Joseph was forced to give up much of Spain, and he even offered his abdication to his brother. Napoleon, though, was determined to control Spain, and sent massive reinforcements to try and pacify the country. The remainder of Joseph's reign, therefore, would be reliant on the military victories of French troops, with Joseph having little control over the various French marshals operating in what was supposed to be his country. Though Joseph attempted some reforms, the Peninsular War and the wider Napoleonic Wars took precedence over his own wishes, and he could do little to improve the country in the meantime. The French were gradually forced to cede more and more of Spain as military defeats in Russia and Germany signaled the gradual collapse of Napoleon's empire. Joseph would leave Madrid and then Spain entirely in 1813 as the War of the Sixth Coalition turned against France on all fronts. He would briefly command the defense of Paris in 1814, but with defeat inevitable, he would leave France entirely, taking a ship to America. He avoided capture by the British on 3 occasions when the ship was searched. For 15 years he would live in the United States, first in New York and Philadelphia, then settling down in New Jersey. Eventually he would move back to Europe, first London, then Genoa, before finally moving to Florence, where he would die in 1844. Lucian Bonaparte stands out from his brothers due to his dedication to the French Revolution from the beginning, and even after its end. When the French Revolution began in 1789, Lucian was 14 years old and attending seminary in southern France. Upon learning of the revolution, he immediately supported it and left for Corsica, where he joined the local Jacobin Club chapter. While in Corsica, he would be an outspoken supporter of Jacobins, before the Bonaparte family was forced to flee from mainland France. He would hold various administrative posts before the fall of the Jacobins in 1795, which led to Lucian being thrown in jail for his well-known connections to them. Thanks to Napoleon's own connections, he was able to secure Lucian's release from prison and give him an administrative job in the army. Lucian did not like the army, however, and so he returned to Corsica, where he would enter politics once more, beginning to serve as a representative for the island in 1798 back in Paris. In 1799, Lucian became the president of the Council of 500, which acted as the lower house of the French legislature in the Republic. As president, he would play a critical role in the coup of 18th Brumaire, as he had become convinced that the government was no longer in the best interests of the people. During the coup, he was the one to spread the rumor of a supposed Jacobin plot and convince the government to relocate to an isolated location. During a key moment of the coup, when Napoleon had entered the chambers of the Council of 500, only to be met by determined resistance, Lucian called upon the grenadiers outside to come to Napoleon's aid. They prevented the declaration of Napoleon as an outlaw and dispersed the assembly. Thanks to his actions, the coup was a bloodless success. After the coup's completion, Lucian would go on to organize Napoleon's election as first consul and would falsify the national referendum that would announce that 99% of the country supported the new constitution. Napoleon would appoint Lucian to various positions in his government, but increasingly strained relations between the brothers over Napoleon's consolidation of power meant that Lucian was repeatedly moved from role to role. Lucian was by far the biggest supporter of the ideals of the revolution out of the Bonaparte family, despite his actions that ultimately led to the end of the revolution itself. Napoleon's decision to make himself emperor and desire to marry his brother off to a Spanish princess after his first wife's death was a step too far for Lucian. In 1803, he secretly married against his brother's wishes, completing the rift between the two. Shortly afterwards, he would leave France for Rome, where he would remain for several years, despite Napoleon's best efforts to convince him to divorce his wife and return to France. By 1809, Rome was firmly under the control of France, and the pressure on Lucian to acquiesce to Napoleon's wishes reached its peak. Lucian essentially became a prisoner on his estate, requiring permission to leave it. To escape the demands of his brother, he attempted to smuggle himself to America, but his ship was caught by the British and he was taken back to Britain. Many British viewed Lucian as anti-Napoleon and so welcomed him, with his family being allowed to settle in Britain under only light surveillance. Napoleon, meanwhile, believed that his brother had gone to Britain on purpose and viewed him as a traitor. Lucian would only return to France after his brother's abdication in 1814, when he would also receive the titles of Prince of Canio, Count of Apollino, and Lord of Nemours by Pope Pius VII. Interestingly, Lucian rallied to Napoleon's return during the 100 Days, aiding him in his last bid for victory. Lucian would support his brother to the end, leaving for Italy once more after his final defeat, where he would remain for the rest of his life. He would write several literary works before his eventual death in 1840 of stomach cancer, just like his brother. Out of all of his sisters, Napoleon trusted only one with serious political power. Elisa Bonaparte was born in 1777 and was the fourth oldest surviving Bonaparte child. She attended school in Paris, beginning in 1784, where she would be visited by her brother Napoleon frequently, until the school's closing in 1792 due to the Revolution. She would remain with the rest of the family during their move from Corsica to southern France in 1795, where she would meet her soon-to-be husband, Felice Bacchiocchi, a former captain in the Royal Army. They would marry in 1797, and Bacchiocchi would be promoted to Chief de Battalion. In 1799, the family would relocate to Paris, where Elisa was close to her brother Lucian. Both had interests in the arts and collaborated on several projects. After Lucian's first wife passed away, Elisa would begin to take care of his two daughters for a time. Her husband would even accompany Lucian during his brief posting as French ambassador to Spain. The birth of the empire would see Elisa be given increasing influence, as she was gifted the Principality of Piombino in Italy to rule over. Napoleon would later expand her territory to include the Principality of Lucca. Despite the relatively small size of the territory in comparison to what Napoleon would give some of his brothers, the territory was still significant. Elisa would take the management of her territory seriously, investing heavily in the expansion of its economy, arts, medical care, and education. While many of her works were viewed positively, her efforts to expand her palace in the city itself required the demolishing of a number of other buildings, including a well-known church that greatly angered the population. Increasing demands by Napoleon to supply his war effort also contributed to Elisa's experiencing a decline in popularity as the years went on. In 1809, Napoleon made Elisa the Grand Duchess of Tuscany. However, unlike her previous territories, he maintained absolute control. Any order he gave concerning the territory had to be followed. Her rule there was unpopular from the start due to ongoing resistance against the French policy of conscription. Napoleon's additional demands for huge sums of money for his war effort meant that Elisa could not invest the same resources into her new, larger territory as she had been able to in the past. The collapse of Napoleon's empire and the betrayal of Murat in Naples meant that Elisa would be compelled to flee her holdings. She was forced to abdicate and would briefly be arrested while seeking shelter in Austria in 1814, before eventually being allowed to return to Italy. Elisa would take no part in the 100 Days, staying in Italy and dying only 5 years later on August 7, 1820, the only one of Napoleon's siblings that survived childhood to die before him. Bonaparte would prove to be one of the most difficult of Napoleon's brothers to manage. Like Napoleon, Louis would attend a military school in France before leaving to join his brother in the army. Benefiting from Napoleon's quick rise through the ranks, Louis would act as his aide-de-camp in Egypt and Syria. He would receive rapid promotions, becoming a general before the coup of 18th Brumaire. After the successful coup, Napoleon would pressure Louis to marry the daughter of his wife Josephine. Neither Louis or his soon-to-be wife, Hortense de Beauharnais, were particularly fond of the idea, but both would eventually be convinced to accept the marriage for the sake of bringing the family closer together. The result proved to be the opposite, as for the majority of their lives the two would live separately, despite having several children. A large issue both in the marriage and in the relations between Louis and Napoleon would begin with Napoleon's appointment of his brother as the King of Holland in 1806. During the Revolutionary Wars, a sister republic was established after seizing much of the territory that now makes up the modern-day Netherlands. Napoleon viewed the Batavian Republic as too independent for his liking, establishing a kingdom in its place, with Louis as monarch, an arrangement that Napoleon thought he could easily control. The move would backfire as Louis took his new role as monarch very seriously, committing to his new role fully. Louis declared himself Dutch, began learning the language, and demanded that his court, made up of many Frenchmen, do the same, in addition to them giving up their French citizenship for Dutch citizenship. His wife Hortense hated the idea and refused to move to Holland at first. Napoleon had to order her to move to the country. After finally arriving, she avoided her husband as much as she could. Napoleon generally found equal concern with Louis's actions, backing Hortense's decision to refuse to send Louis's sons to Holland for a time, out of concern that they would become Dutch, never to return to France. In contrast, the people of Holland responded positively to Louis's efforts to integrate himself with his country, especially after he personally assisted in aiding the city of Leyden following the explosion of a ship carrying gunpowder that blew up in the heart of the city in 1807, and after he assisted in the aftermath of a flood in 1809. Louis would go so far as to refuse to reduce the value of Dutch loans held by France, which would have resulted in harm to the Dutch economy, angering Napoleon. The breaking point between Louis and Napoleon would come with Napoleon's demand for control over all Dutch troops. Louis refused the demand, and in retaliation, Napoleon withdrew the majority of French garrisons in the country. The now relatively undefended Kingdom of Holland would be invaded in 1809 by a British expedition of 40,000 men. Unable to fend them off by himself, tens of thousands of French reinforcements had to be sent to aid in the defense of Holland. Afterwards, Napoleon suggested that his brother should abdicate due to being unable to defend his country. In response, Louis refused and declared the occupation of Holland by French forces unlawful. With no hope of actually backing up his declaration, however, Louis was forced to abdicate with the French invasion, swiftly securing the country shortly after, before Napoleon annexed the country fully into France. Now in exile, Louis would spend the remainder of the Napoleonic Wars in Austria, before moving around Europe and eventually settling in Italy. He would spend most of his remaining life there uneventfully, before dying in 1846. Pauline Bonaparte would live the most independent life out of all the Bonaparte sisters, taking advantage of her status to its full extent. She would accompany the rest of the family during their move to mainland France, and once there would be married to a French general named Charles Leclerc by Napoleon in 1797. In 1798, Pauline would move to Paris, where she would enjoy the social life immensely. Her time there would not last forever, as in 1801 her husband Leclerc would be sent by Napoleon to Saint Dominique to reconquer the island from the ongoing slave revolt taking place. Pauline would accompany him there, and though it was a far cry from Paris, her status made her the most important woman on the island and the center of attention. She would even refuse to return to France when asked to by her husband unless he paid her 100,000 francs. Her time in the island would also lead to her gaining a certain reputation for the numerous affairs she conducted. Pauline's health at the same time was steadily deteriorating as she faced several bouts of yellow fever that gradually weakened her. When her husband passed away due to the same disease, she decided to immediately return to France. Arriving back in France at the very start of 1803, she inherited a vast sum of money from her late husband. Besides buying herself a new residence with her new wealth, Pauline did not have much to keep her occupied, as the civil code of mourning established by her brother prevented her from re-entering Parisian society for some time. Not wishing for his sister to remain unmarried for too long, Napoleon sought out a match for her. He found a match in Camillo Borghese, the sixth prince of Samoa and a Roman noble. The two would marry, but due to them marrying secretly before Pauline's official mourning period was over, Napoleon refused to acknowledge Pauline's new title of princess. After the marriage, Pauline would move to Rome, where she would swiftly work to insert herself into society there. Her marriage, however, was less successful than her first, as neither truly cared for the other, with both taking on their own affairs. Pauline's only son from her first marriage would also die in 1804 at the age of 6, with her having no more children afterwards. Her wealth allowed her great freedom to do as she pleased for the most part, with the sale of a duchy given to her by Napoleon for 6 million francs, making her extremely rich. That money would prove useful, as though Pauline lived a mostly uneventful life for the remainder of the Napoleonic Wars, she proved to be the most loyal out of all of the Bonaparte siblings to Napoleon. She accompanied him to his exile in Elba and used her wealth to help fund his time there. Though he failed in his 100 Days campaign, she maintained her support for him, lobbying the British to end his exile in St. Helena due to his health. She even tried to visit him when his health continued to deteriorate, but Napoleon passed before she was able to. Pauline would spend the remainder of her life in Rome under the protection of the Pope, dying in 1825. Pauline Bonaparte was the youngest of Napoleon's sisters, and she would prove both intelligent and ambitious. She would accompany the family's move from Corsica and would attend school in France for several years before meeting and falling in love with one of her brother's top cavalry officers, Joachim Murat. They would marry in 1800, and she would become an imperial princess with the founding of the French Empire. In 1806, she would become the Queen of Naples, thanks to her husband's appointment as king after Joseph's move to the Spanish throne. She would involve herself both in politics in Naples and back in France, with her opposition to Josephine contributing to the eventual divorce. She arranged for Napoleon to take on Mistress, proving that Josephine was the issue standing in the way of an heir. Due to Murat's military responsibilities, Caroline often acted as regent in his stead, though neither were able to overcome the general dissatisfaction the population of Naples held towards the French since the beginning of Joseph's reign. When Murat decided to betray Napoleon in an effort to maintain his own throne, Caroline supported him, and would again when he decided to declare for Napoleon during the 100 Days. After Murat's defeat and execution, she was forced to flee in exile to Austria. Eventually, she was allowed to return to Italy, where she would live in Florence until her death in 1839. The youngest of the Bonapartes was Drome. Born in 1784, he was only 4 years old when the French Revolution began and would benefit from Napoleon's success from a young age. He would go to school in Paris before graduating and briefly being in the Consular Guard before getting wounded in a duel. He was quickly transferred to the Navy by his brother and sent to the French West Indies to assist in the effort to re-establish control over St. Dominique. While at sea, he somehow accidentally shot at a British ship and nearly escalated the war against the British in the area. After being ordered to return to France, he decided to instead head for America to avoid capture by the British and to let the incident blow over with Napoleon. In America, he rapidly began racking up debts and was nearly in another duel over reportedly tarnishing the lady's honor. He would make his way to Baltimore, where he would meet Elizabeth Patterson, who he would quickly marry on the Christmas Eve of 1803, against the wishes of her father. Upon learning of the marriage, Napoleon was furious, as it went against his policy of strengthening his position in Europe by marrying his family to European nobility. Napoleon would attempt to get the Pope to annul the marriage, to no success. With Drome and his now pregnant wife on their way back to France in 1805, Napoleon resulted to annulling the marriage by royal decree. The couple would land in Portugal, with Drome leaving his wife to try and convince his brother to allow the marriage. Elizabeth, meanwhile, would attempt to land in Amsterdam to obtain French citizenship for her child, but the ship was not allowed to dock by order of Napoleon. Drome was eventually convinced by Napoleon to give up on his marriage, with Elizabeth giving birth to her child in Britain before eventually heading back to America. They would never speak to each other again, and Drome would remarry to a bride of Napoleon's choosing in 1807, after being made King of Westphalia. As king, Drome continued his bad spending habits, emptying the treasury and accumulating a large number of debts. Napoleon looked down on his brother due to his perceived inability to rule, but nevertheless gave him a military command as part of his 1812 invasion of Russia. Drome attempted to bring much of his court with him on the military campaign, but after being reprimanded by Napoleon for his actions, he abandoned the campaign entirely. He would play no part in the 1813 campaign outside of attempting to mount a defense of his own realm that amounted to nothing. Despite Jerome's repeated failings, Napoleon would allow him to play one last part in the Napoleonic Wars after his return during the 100 Days. He was once more given a military command. His division made the initial attack on Hougomont that led to massive French casualties, as Jerome fully committed his troops to the attack. After Napoleon's second abdication, Jerome would move to Italy, where he would remain until the creation of the Second French Empire. He was the only Bonaparte sibling to see the foundation of the Second Empire, and as the last surviving brother of Napoleon, he was given several honors by the new government. They were, however, mostly honorary in nature, on account of his previously poor performance in positions of importance. Jerome would not outlive the Second Empire, passing away in 1860 at the age of 75. The Bonapartes as a family were as colorful and varied as possible. Napoleon's efforts to take advantage of family ties to secure control over Europe failed as often as it succeeded, and was often impeded by his own actions in service of his constant wars. Each member of his family benefited at some point or another from Napoleon's status, though not all agreed with his actions or even supported him. When push came to shove, most of the family did come to his defense, especially in 1815 when he risked it all. How much of that was out of a duty to family, desire for a return to glory, or of genuine support is up for debate.